Good morning, one and all. Sorry, good afternoon. That's a good start. Today we've got a really exciting webinar for you. We have Paul Feldwick, who has just written a new book called Why Does the Pedlar Sing? We have Lucy Banister from Nursery, Planning and Research. I'm really looking forward to it. So Paul is going to be discussing why qualitative research is key to finding out whether what you're doing in advertising terms is popular or not, and if not, how to make it so. And I hope Lucy's going to ask him some taxing questions along the way. The book has got a whole load of really interesting case studies, so I would advise reading it. And I don't normally plug books, but it was a very enjoyable one. So maybe, Paul, you'd like to kick off by just telling us how it came about and a bit of what's in it.
Thank you, Luella. Why Does the Pedlar Sing is really a book about the relationship between advertising and entertainment in a broad sense. And in a way that's quite obvious. I mean, we all know so much advertising throughout the ages has involved song and dance, humor, cartoons, talking animals, sex appeal, all the tricks and tropes of popular culture. And yet, although I worked in advertising for over 30 years and have continued to be associated with it for another 15 or so, it struck me that nobody ever really talks about that in a serious way. It's almost like it's either a kind of irrelevance and perhaps something that shouldn't be encouraged too much, or at best, it's a little bit of sort of added gloss that adds to the serious business of ads that communicate propositions and messages and consumer benefits and all those important things that we're taught about when we work in advertising. And yet it seemed to me that it's probably fundamentally a lot more important than that. So I tried to sort of explain why I think it is. And I think that we can explain that today very much in terms of how it creates mental availability or fame for brands, and also how it creates liking for brands, and that those are probably much more important mechanisms for how advertising influences people than those rational communications which have always been privileged in the official way we talk about it. That's not to say those are completely irrelevant. They, in their right place, they can be very important too. But that when you think about all the great advertising campaigns of the past, the Smash Martians, the Honey Monster, or all those sort of things, you think, well, actually, they're not saying very much about the product. They're actually much more working as pieces of entertainment, and that's how advertising works. So within that context, I think the role for qualitative research is not just about, did it communicate this message, very plonky type of question, but actually much more subtle. How are people responding to this? Is this something that they're getting into? Is this something that they're enjoying? Are they likely to talk about it, share it with their friends? And certainly that's how we used to use it at BNP.
So Lucy, what really interested you in the book?
There was loads of stuff that interested me in the book. I really, really enjoyed reading it. And I was fascinated, firstly, to read all the history. You must have done a lot of research, Paul, and to find out how many of the things that we think of as quite modern and quite contemporary go right back into the 19th century. So I felt it placed a lot of the development of advertising and how we look at advertising in perspective, which was fascinating. But what I also found really interesting, and which really chimed with my own experience, with when, Paul, you recounted what happened on various advertising development projects you'd worked on where research was involved, and how quite often it wasn't a linear process. It was something that proceeded in an unpredictable way. Consumers in groups wouldn't say exactly what you might expect them to. Something would pop up on one side, you'd have an issue with budget, and the idea would have to be developed as it went along. And of course, that is what happens in my own experience when we write it up, when we look back on it. We all of us make it into a very logical process, but actually there's a lot more happy accident at work. So it was fascinating to see that laid bare, because that's so true to one's own experience. And it's good to see that it isn't all being placed in a logical framework.
It's certainly not, because I think it is necessarily, it's a creative process. And, you know, you do not get creative processes right first time. If you've ever seen film of Picasso painting, you know, he doesn't just go and do his painting, although he was quite capable of doing it. He covers his canvas with paint, and then he paints over half of it, and then he paints over the other half of it, and then he paints over it again. It's something that is continually evolving, and that's often the way with ads. I mean, there are two particular cases in the book, which in very different ways, I think, illustrate that. One is the Honey Monster, which is, to be, you know, going back a long time. This is the early 70s, and yet it's a campaign that continues to run in a slightly different form today. And the Honey Monster was created by John Webster. In the original format, the monster was small and very fast and very noisy. And actually, both the mothers and children disliked it intensely. The mothers disliked it because they said, oh, that reminds me too much of my own children when they're naughty, and I don't like it. And the children didn't get it because they said, that's not what a monster is. A monster is big and a monster is clumsy. And so this was fed back to John Webster. And John Webster loved working with research, because what he really wanted always was to produce stuff that was popular. And so John would listen with a lot of interest to this. And if he had any great disappointment about his wonderful creation not working, he very quickly got over it, because he just said, well, in that case, how about this? We'll just make the monster massive. We'll turn this monster into a large, clumsy monster. And that's what he became, you know, this strange sort of childish but enormous beast with big googly eyes and a big deep voice that behaves like a 5-year-old. And that was enormously appealing, both to the mothers and the children. But again, the emphasis in that research is not about, you know, are we communicating that this contains honey? I mean, that's going to happen anyway, because he's called the Honey Monster. But actually, what's much more important is, do people want to see this Honey Monster? Do they want him to appear in their living rooms? And are they going to want to see it again? And are they going to talk about it in the playground? And are our children on the bus to school going to go around lifting their shoulders and saying, tell them about the honey bunny, which is all the things that actually happen, because that's what created fame for the Honey Monster, and of course fame and therefore sales for Sugar Puffs.
Yeah.
So could that creative process still happen today? Does it still happen today?
Well, I don't think it does happen today, but I see absolutely no reason why it shouldn't happen today. I mean, in many ways, it should be much easier to show, you know, rough versions of films to people than it was then. I mean, back in the 70s, domestic video recorders didn't even exist. Planners had to drive up to Sheffield with a sort of reel-to-reel video player that weighed a ton and a monitor in the back of their car and set it up in the recruiter's living room. It took 2 or 3 weeks to make an animatic, because everything had to be drawn by hand, physically shot with a rostrum camera, married on a double head with a soundtrack. I mean, nowadays, presumably all of these things could be done digitally. The film could be showed to a panel of people online, like what we're doing now. And you could have those kind of discussions infinitely easier. I'm not aware that anybody is actually doing that. And certainly when I look at the ads on the TV, I think, well, that ad doesn't look like anybody subjected it to any meaningful research, mainly because I look at it and I think I didn't understand what on earth was going on in that ad. There was a thought there, you know, there was an intention, but what they didn't check out was, did that intention come across? Did people understand that film? Did they like it? Did they enjoy it? You know, was there something in it that they wanted to see again? Nobody seems interested in asking those questions, but I see absolutely no reason why they shouldn't do. I mean, Lucy, what's your experience of that? Because you are a researcher nowadays.
My experience is we absolutely love research and creative development that's an iterative process. but there is very little of that around, and that is to do with budget reasons. So it isn't so much making the animatic, it's simply getting the research done, getting an outside research company to do it. Clients don't often have the budget to do wave after wave of research. And what we find is that in-house research that agencies carried out, as happened at BMP when the planners would go off and do the research themselves, just doesn't seem to happen anymore. Very, very rarely. Perhaps for a pitch, planners might go off and do a few groups themselves. But it feels as if that's a skill that used to be considered part of the planner's toolkit.
Well, of course, it was much more of, it was part of the planner's toolkit at BMP. It wasn't at many other agencies, to be sure, but it just happened to work for us incredibly well.
Yeah.
I mean, I do want to sort of, sorry, Lucy, go on.
No, I was just thinking that when I started out in research, there did seem to be more planners doing their own groups and able to build some kind of consumer input into the creative development than there is now. I mean, I've worked with the APG. We run courses to teach young planners how to do research and how to use it and how to benefit from it. And even if planners didn't ever do as much as at the MP, they certainly did some, but that's a skill that seems to be fading.
No, well, I think that's a great shame. I mean, planners nowadays don't call themselves planners, of course, they tend to call themselves strategists. And I mean, it reminds me of that thing that, I mean, I have huge respect for Stephen King, but he is often remembered for that remark he made about the different schools of planning, whatever he meant by it. And he said there are the grand strategists and there are the ad tweakers. Which, of course, the choice of words there is pretty loaded. You know, you can be a grand strategist or you can just be an ad tweaker. Personally, I have always thought that what he calls ad tweaking is frankly much more important because all that anybody ever sees at the end of the day is an ad. You know, your strategy may or may not be important. It very often is not that important. And even if it is, you know, it shouldn't show. What matters is the ad. It's relatively easy to produce a strategy. It's actually very difficult to produce a great ad. And that's where I think we have got the whole thing completely the wrong way around. But sorry, I just want to say back to something you said earlier, Luella, which is, you said that, you know, you sort of quoted me as saying that qualitative research was an essential part of creating good advertising. I wouldn't put it that strongly. I mean, for me, it's an incredibly useful tool for making advertising that works. But I mean, if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, one of the great rival agencies to us was Collett Dickinson Pierce. And they tended to not use research to test ads at all. You know, they were very anti that. They were totally on the lines of our judgment counts. And there were even sort of very notorious occasions, which, you know, we were never allowed to forget about, like the Heineken campaign, which was researched. And the initial ads sort of came back with a pretty sort of, you know, lukewarm response. And Frank Lowe just said to the client, well, let's just throw this in the bin and ignore it. And of course, they ran the campaign and it went on to become a great campaign, which also happens and can quite easily happen. Research is never going to be infallible. What we're talking about is, you know, trying to predict the next hit movie, the next you know, the next hit record, the next Beatles. And, you know, even the most experienced impresarios get all those things wrong. There is no, you know, certain formula for doing it. So CDP actually produced a reel of ads which were, you know, probably as popular and as famous as ours in a slightly different way without using any research at all. The important thing that we both had in common, I think, was that we were both trying to do the same thing. We both were trying to produce popular advertising that people would enjoy and that would be entertaining. And one of my big worries about what's going on today is that there are very few agencies that genuinely want to do that. In fact, I suspect that there are people in creative departments who actively don't want to do that, who actually regard words like populist as a sort of bad thing and really don't don't want to be sort of talked about in the pub or the playground the way that John Webster used to be. So I think research is incredibly helpful, and I would certainly recommend it. But it's not in fact, you know, it's neither infallible nor essential.
No.
And even I am not going to argue for it being essential, but I think useful, it's very important. And I think it can be illuminating. Useful can sound a bit utilitarian, but I think when we do research projects, we feel that we have most helped the process when we've been able to explore ideas and identify where the potential lies. So that when we go back to agencies and clients and we say, we put your ideas in front of them, and this bit here is what sparked energy, what got people interested. It's a bit like mining for gold, isn't it? We found a nugget over there. We think that's a good place to go to dig for gold.
Yeah.
And also guidance as well. You know, you can identify from the response that people have that here is an area that you might want to be careful about, you know, how you execute it. But there is magic in the creative process. It is alchemy, and there's no way that research can create that or predict that. We're there to help along the way.
Chloe asked a question earlier on, and I don't know whether the pair of you can see it, and if not, I'll read it out. It says, I think emotional response is such an important thing, especially the idea of whether people are enjoying or getting into a piece of communications. But I really struggle helping clients develop stimulus that creates authentic emotional engagement. Scripts just make that so hard, especially if something is supposed to be funny, light, etc. So I don't know whether you've got any advice for her.
I think scripts are terrible, worse than useless. There is only one way that you can research an ad. If you don't have a finished ad, which is the ideal thing in many ways, and you know, it is not crazy to suggest that you should research an ad once you've finished it. Even if you spent a lot of money on it, you can very often improve it by editing it enormously. Or if the worst comes to the worst, you can at least stop yourself spending several £1,000,000 showing an ad that doesn't work on the telly, and you can write it off and do something else. I mean, it is that important. But since that is relatively rare, the next best thing is what we used to call an animatic. And as I say, it should be much easier today to produce good animatics than it was 30 or 40 years ago. An animatic is basically drawings or photographs occasionally which show what you would see in the ad in real time over the 30 seconds with a soundtrack, so that people are actually exposed to something that's very close to the finished ad, although it's not identical. And of course, it loses some of the nuance, it loses some of the subtlety, but actually, in the vast majority of cases, it is close enough for you to be able to detect how people are going to respond to this, because you can get voices into it, you can get music into it, you can get timing into it, you can get camera angles into it. And those are all the things that make an ad. An ad is not about an idea, it is not about a script. It is actually a sequence of sounds and images happening in real time. You can recreate that very well with an animatic. And if you don't get a positive response to an animatic, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a positive response to a finished film, however much you may delude yourself that, you know, oh, when it's filmed, it's going to make all the difference. So I think there is a way of doing it, but it is labor intensive. You do have to be committed to it. But, you know, we did it all the time. In BMP, we did it on every single TV commercial that we produced, certainly up to about 1990. And that made a huge difference to the quality of our output.
I must admit, it's quite rare that we get animatics as stimulus. And I totally agree with Chloe about the challenge of getting the stimulus right in order to be able to get the right response. But I think it's quite useful to remember at what point you are in the process. And so you can use mood films, you can use mood boards, You can use found imagery. I think it's a case of horses for courses, and that there are other forms of stimulus that can help. And if you're very early stages of development, you might not necessarily be able to put together an animatic. But I think you have to always recognise research's limitations. Even with the best possible stimulus, there is only so far that you can get. And I think actually it can help to spend as much time as possible understanding what your target market enjoy. If you know the sorts of advertising ideas that they like, that they remember, that stick with them, then you can put that with your response to the stimulus material and gauge what is going to be important to bear in mind when you execute. So I think as well as identifying potential, research is really, really important at helping you understand what the consumer is thinking, what the consumer reacts well to, and how they feel about the brand and how it communicates. And I think it's incredibly important as well to make sure that at some point, whether it's actually even after it's been aired, you have some qualitative feedback on the finished campaign, so that you can learn from season 1 and make season 2 even better.
I'm sure you'll have seen various bits of chat come in. There is one on the Q&A, which is from Leslie Hallam, which said, surely excellent qual is part of the creative process, not something that stands apart or above or even below. Qual is the cocaine of creativity, makes a good woman or man great.
Wow. I think I look at my career in a completely different light now.
Well, I couldn't argue with that. I mean, I think the idea that qualitative research, particularly qualitative research that looks at, creative development, is an integral part of the creative process, or should be seen as that, and therefore it should be seen first of all as being done for the benefit of and in collaboration with those who are creating the ad. Too often it's presented as a sort of external police force that is there to kind of double check that the agency aren't trying to rip the client off. I mean, if you're starting from that point of view, it's almost bound to go wrong. It's like, what Deming found with production lines, that if quality control is separate from the production line, then it doesn't work. The people on the production line resent it. They don't work with it. If you actually put the people on the production line in charge of quality control, they take responsibility for it, they solve the problems, they actually improve the quality of their work actively all the time. And that's the way, I mean, I suppose that was reflected back in the day at BMP, because so much of the pre-testing work was done by the planners themselves. That doesn't mean it has to be, but I mean, there does have to be a very close relationship between the researcher and the creative people. And I think that's quite hard to achieve, given some of the cultural realities that we're starting from.
It's very rare that we meet the people who are responsible with coming up with the ideas that we research. And it's a pleasure, and it's always really, really insightful for us if we can meet them. I mean, it's fantastic to have the person who came up with the idea explain to you how they would like to see it working and how it should best be expressed. And it doesn't happen very much.
I mean, the whole notion that there is a thing called a debrief, which is a sort of one way, we are telling you this, and then you have to go away and decide what to do with it, is part of the problem. It has to be a dialogue, or it should be a dialogue, where they say, well, we were trying to get this across, and you say, well, that's not getting across because they didn't understand that. So, but if you did this, they would understand it, or whatever it is. There's so much that can be done when you have a creative dialogue, and the thing will evolve into something that works.
And I think dialogue is very important all the way through, so that everyone feels like a team, so that clients, agency, strategists, researcher, creatives, everyone feels like they're working for the same goal, and everyone feels that you as the researcher are there to help. You're not there to kind of trample all over creativity and squash any great ideas. But it's in your
True.
you're as interested and motivated to make the idea as successful as possible.
Although
But
there are also times, Lucy, when actually the thing that is really needed from the researcher is precisely to squash the idea and say, this is just not going anywhere. If I were you, I would start again. But to give some, constructive ideas as to where you might start again. And the other big story that I tell at great length in the book is the Rowan Atkinson Barclaycard campaign. And, we got into a terrible pickle there because we had a big pitch-winning campaign, which went out to qualitative research and frankly didn't work, but it was an external research company who kept coming back and saying, I'm sure we can get this right. I'm sure we can tweak it. We're going to be constructive. We're not going to squash it. And every time we tweaked it, it got worse and worse until we almost missed the air date. So, there are times when I think you have to be frank, you have to be brutal. And hopefully in a sort of way that opens up a new door. But, just to say, oh, we are trying to respect the genius of the creative people, so we mustn't squash this great idea, is a dangerous place to get into.
I think it's always about being constructive, isn't it? It's always giving someone the light, even if what you have is not working very well. You always discover something from the research that can be worked with, which isn't to say that you're going to give the thumbs up to everything, but there should be some kind of constructive way forward coming out of the research.
Well, the denouement,
even if it is to go in a different direction altogether.
The denouement of that Barclaycard saga was the final groups that I got to do because the external researchers weren't available, where we had 2 new campaigns, both of which bombed. And the only thing I could salvage from that experience was when I turned around to the respondents and said, well, what do you think we should do? And they said, well, use Rowan Atkinson anyway, because he's funny whatever he does. And that was about all I had to go on. But actually, it was a huge insight because it really sort of reoriented the whole campaign in terms of actually, use Rowan Atkinson, make it entertaining, which we did. And then everything else fell into place. So yeah, I mean it's a funny story, but there's a truth behind it as well.
So often the thing that is going to make the idea work is completely different from what everyone expects it to be.
Yep.
Everyone's focused, the team are focused on one thing, and you come back from the research and said, that thing there that you're all thinking was the heart of it, actually the heart of it's somewhere over there. And I think your phrase reorientation absolutely captures it.
We've got questions and comments coming hand over fist. So I think I'll do 2 or 3 together and you can pick out what you fancy. One related to earlier on, which was from Stuart Natman, who said, mostly agree, but I just ran a creative development project in which people were almost moved to tears by storyboards and soundtracks. No production at all. Great emotional campaign that I'm sure 100% will work. But of course, this requires a creative agency, which is invested in getting it right, and some are better than others. Chloe then came in and said, I'm going to big up face-to-face here. I found it far harder to research creative ideas and communications on Zoom than I have face-to-face. My only face-to-face groups this side of COVID could not have been done online. All the moderation tips needed in full force to help consumers understand and reflect on the creative ideas. And Leslie agrees and said online is in danger of further and irrevocably commoditizing qual. You need to be sharing minds. And the last one, which is from Joanna Barnett, who says, I'm interested to hear Paul say that likability is a key factor for success. I'd argue that fame is more important than likability, even if that means extreme disagreement or dislike for the message or ad, as long as it creates talkability. Would be interested to hear their thoughts on this. So,
can I pick up on that last point first, since I was mentioned by name? I absolutely don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I think likability and fame are certainly linked. That, if you like a pop record, if you like a film, it's more likely to become a famous one. And yet, And I mean, there are many examples of this in the book, going right back to the days of P.T. Barnum. Of course, anything that generates controversy or polarizes opinion is also incredibly powerful in creating fame. You know, I mean, I take, as one example, I take, you know, Strictly Come Dancing, because a very successful program, and part of its appeal now is the way that it meshes with people's ability to interact with it. So that, you know, when my family are watching Strictly Come Dancing, they're all on their WhatsApp group simultaneously arguing about, you know, I thought she was rubbish, and, you know, he really shouldn't have got 7 points, and what is Craig thinking of to only give him 3, and do you suppose they're really having it off, and all these things which make Strictly so involving. And of course, polarizing characters, even right up to and including, you know, somebody like Donald Trump, are hugely famous because they are polarizing. Elon Musk is polarizing, Jeff Bezos is polarizing, and it's part of their fame. So yes, this is true, and I think you really need to be sensitive to that. Of course, it's not a great sort of secret to say this, but, you know, if people in groups are being exercised and some of them are saying, I thought that was terrible rubbish, you know, or I thought that was silly. I mean, I remember a very common response to very popular, famous campaigns was there would always be quite a lot of people in the groups who would go, oh, that's stupid nonsense, those stupid chimpanzees, I can't stand them. And of course, you'd have the client behind the glass going, oh dear, there's something terribly wrong. And actually, the reality is that was all part of what made it work. So yeah, I agree with the last point.
I think the thing that you should be most worried about is actually indifference. If you're sitting there in a group and you're not moving people in any way.
In a way, it was terribly simple what we were looking for, you know. And I mean, I also agree with the point that it's probably very, very difficult to do this on Zoom. I haven't tried, and I wouldn't really like to. I'd always much rather be in real life. But, you know, if you sit in a room of people and show them an ad and you get stony faces and nobody has anything to say, it's very hard to retain any enthusiasm for this ad, you know, if they have nothing whatever to say about it. And you find out what's going on here, and oh, it's just miserable, it's just boring. And yet sometimes they have things to say that are insightful, and sometimes it's really difficult to get them to say anything that's insightful because it's simply this sort of inertia response. On the other hand, you know, if you just see people sort of laugh and say, oh, that's quite fun, I'd like to see that again, you kind of go, oh, we're onto something here. Yes. I mean, we didn't talk about this much at the time because we were always having to pretend that this was about something much more important, like, are we transmitting the consumer benefit or whatever. But actually the reality of what we were doing in those groups a lot of the time was simply seeing, you know, is there a sort of glimmer of excitement, of enthusiasm, or indeed controversy here? Because that's something we can work with. The other thing is comprehension. I mean, it's also, and I think this is very common, and it comes back to something I said earlier, that I think a lot of ads today go wrong, not because they don't have a sort of potentially interesting idea behind them, but because people simply don't understand what's happening in that ad, because they haven't researched it in a form in which that can be checked. So, you know, if it's incomprehensible, it's a waste of time, to be honest.
So do you think that creativity has suffered in lockdown?
Ooh, interesting question.
I think it suffered a long time before lockdown.
I can't pinpoint, because we haven't actually, I suppose, it might feel like forever. We haven't been in lockdown that long in the life of a lot of creative development. I mean, I would just like to come back to the point about doing Qual on Zoom and how frustrating that can be, because it's flat. I mean, it's literally flat, but it's hard to get the energy levels up. And just not being in 3 dimensions, not being able to sense the space, not to be able to get 100% engagement from the people who are taking part, because it's so easy just to have your phone to one side, to get distracted by what's going on in the background, to tune in and tune out, which is what I think we all do in Zoom meetings. And I think you miss so much. And creative development should be kind of generative, it should be emotional, it should be creative. And I don't think that you get that on screen.
Mm.
I think that sounds very, very likely.
But I suspect that for a lot of clients, it will just be the cheap, easy option. And you know, we'll be arguing for a project that we'll need face to face, and they've kind of been spoiled over lockdown, and they're thinking, well, actually, I just quite like to sit at home. And what we have found is that before, you'd have had a team of clients coming along to the studio to watch, and they'd watch the first couple of groups, and then everything else would go off, and perhaps someone would listen to the audio, but most of the time they wouldn't. But we have a real pattern of behavior where clients are watching everything. Ooh. So they're binging on everything, and as we all know, it can be quite tricky if they've watched everything and they feel they know what the answer is.
Yeah. No, well, that's a whole other topic, possibly for another day, is, you know, how to ensure that all the people who are watching the groups are, you know, not just drawing their own conclusions.
Absolutely. We've made it easier
to also allow them to have an input. But yeah, that can be very dangerous, because, you know, everybody finds one thing they dislike and it's like nothing ever gets through. Yeah. That's when research does justifiably gets a bad rap. And that's why I think creative people are so terrified of it, because, you know, there are so many instances where, you know, the marketing manager is sitting behind the glass and says, oh, there was some person there in Alderley Edge who thought it was rubbish, so I'm never going to run that ad. And I mean, at that point you kind of go, you know, you have to live in the real world.
Yes.
So are there any ads that spring out at you that you've seen over the past sort of year, 18 months, that strike you as really coming out as creative? And do you know whether they had qualitative research in the background?
I don't know how any of these are researched. I mean, Lucy may have case studies that she's worked on.
We never know. We never know what beyond, and unless it gets written up in the media, we never know what gets researched or what doesn't get researched. I mean, I do know that, and I don't know if this is still the case, that the John Lewis ads, the Christmas John Lewis ads, don't get researched. And I think the agency and the client feel that they have a very clear idea of how they're working, and what the ingredients are. I suppose it's a bit like sort of a film studio like Pixar. We know what a John Lewis ad should be. So I think I'm right in saying, but my information might not be up to date, but those don't get researched. I think if there's confidence in the team and a belief in the artistry, I know, Paul, you talk a lot about the importance of artistry. If there's a belief in the artistry, which clearly John Lewis is busting with artistry, then a team can feel that they have everything they need to be able to go forward. Yeah.
As I say, it's one way of doing it, but of course, I mean, I think some research shows that, you know, some of those John Lewis ads are actually much more powerful than others, and, you know, it's worked very well as a campaign because it's been well managed to sort of maintain the hype around it over a number of years. But I mean, some of those films are frankly quite weak.
Yeah.
But at least they're not incomprehensible. I mean, you can always understand what's going on.
Yes. And people bring to them their knowledge. They have a sense in their heads, the framework.
I mean, incidentally, I don't actually know whether Pixar never use any kind of pre-testing research on their films, but I do know that Pixar have a very evolved culture of how they work on those films. There's a wonderful book by Ed Catmull called Creativity, Inc., in which he describes it in a lot of detail. And whether or not they are actually using consumer feedback, there's an enormous amount of internal feedback and criticism. And one of their rules is there has to be absolute candor, you know, and also that criticism has to be given in a way that is constructive. So you can't, you know, people, and there are obviously armies of people involved in producing a Pixar movie. It's an immensely challenging thing, much more challenging than a 60-second commercial. And the quality that comes out is terrific. But they are continually looking at how can we make this this moment more exciting? How can we make this funnier? But also, what's the overall narrative arc here? How can we get more emotional engagement? So it's not just enough to say, I didn't like that scene very much. You have to say, I don't think that scene really works because we haven't quite established why this character cares about that character. And I think that their success in doing that, and Ed Catmull makes it quite clear, it's never easy, it's a continual learning process. But I think it's a tremendous sort of inspiration for how agencies need to practice working, whether or not they're using research. That ability to sort of really interrogate what you're doing in every detail, both looking at the moment and looking at the wider arc. And, you know, I think the more they can do that, the better it will be, whether or not they're using research.
It's the need for joined up thinking, really, isn't it? Okay, we've had a couple more points and a question, I think. So Leslie says, I had a stony-faced response in a group in Glasgow. Guys looking at an ad filled with young women. Mere sexism, someone said, which seemed very enlightened in 1990 until the client translated as more sexism needed. And Chloe responded to that by saying, yep, and the great thing is that viewing facilities offer live streaming as well as live in the room viewing. Big up viewing facilities. Right on. Hang on a minute, I shall go down here. All right, so Chloe says, sometimes clients want me to ask what ads people remember liking or even just remembering. And it feels far harder now. So many times people just can't remember a single one, which I guess is the challenge of so much on-demand TV viewing. Often people.
No, I think it's a consequence of the fact that most advertising today is simply not popular. That the will to do it and the ability to do it seem to be almost entirely lacking. I think it's a terrible indictment of the advertising industry. We always used to start groups like that. You know, tell us about what ads you like. And people would immediately light up. It was a great icebreaker. They'd go, oh, have you seen that one with the Martians or whatever? And they'd all have a laugh. Oh, have you seen that one? Or that one's ridiculous, or I can't stand that one. But, you know, it would come tumbling out. And I mean, Lucy said this to me earlier, you know, it just doesn't happen today. So
no. And
if that isn't an indictment of the advertising industry today, I do not know what is.
I think some of it is a bit to do with on-demand viewing. Because obviously there is an awful lot of Netflix and there is an awful lot of catch up.
Well, you could take that one up with ThinkBox.
We often find that when people say they can't remember any, actually, when the conversation progresses, they do start thinking. They see more ads than they think they do.
Yes.
But I often find that I have to change the question from what have you seen recently, what do you like, to what makes a good ad, just as a way of getting people to
under the skin.
Good.
I'd far rather they could come up with an ad that they've seen and that they can joke about and talk about with other people. But I think it's rarer now to find an ad that everyone in the group has seen. So even if someone can think of something that they've really enjoyed, I think it's rarer now to find something. The big Christmas blockbusters are an exception, to find something that is common to everyone. And then that gets harder because that's your icebreaker. That's where you bring the group together. That's where you create common ground.
Yeah.
And I definitely think you can see the fragmentation in operation.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's the fragmented media or the fragmented ads, to be honest, in that. But hey.
Yeah, I think it's general fragmentation. Yeah.
Have either of you got an ad you'd like to sort of pin up there and go, this is a good one?
Well, I would pin up a campaign rather than a single ad, because I think another of the problems with today's advertising is there's too much emphasis on the single ad. And actually, what we're really talking about is campaigns. We're talking about distinctive assets, about brand properties that develop over time. And, you know, I struggle a bit to find many in the last 10 years that I really rate. I mean, I have quite a lot of time for this lot, the Meerkats. I think it's been incredibly successful. I'm not sure that they've always made the most of this asset. I think some of the recent ads seem to me too much grinding on about their latest product rather than being entertaining. But you know, they will know better than me whether that's working for them or not. So, but I mean, they've basically got a fantastic property that's been going for over 10 years. So that's great success.
They are very good. They're very good at keeping going, consistency.
Yeah.
And I often get a conversation going in a group by chatting about the Meerkats, because someone will talk about them, and I'll just say, so you know, is the campaign coming to an end? Are we getting tired of it? And it's just a good debate.
Icebreaker.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no reason why that campaign should wear out. Absolutely. I mean, as long as it's kept fresh and entertaining, that can go on for another 20 years.
I think as well, and I know Paul and I, we talked about this before, but I think we definitely need a shout out for Specsavers.
That was the other one I was going to mention.
Yeah.
I think Specsavers has been a great campaign. Again, it's run for probably 10 years. I know it's been very successful for Specsavers for their business. And again, it's entertaining. It doesn't really say anything about Specsavers. It just gives you a sort of 60-second entertaining comic film, which is based on somebody not being able to see as well as they ought to. And there's punchline. I mean, it's an old format. It's the Heineken format. It's been done by other brands, but it's been done very successfully. I was quite interesting that I just heard on the grapevine a few months ago, somebody told me that there's a new marketing director at Specsavers who has discontinued that campaign, but remains to be seen whether that's true or not. That may be a rumor, but you know,
definitely get
they would be completely barking mad, to be honest. So
they definitely get the Grand Prix for topical advertising. I mean, I think, you know, the Barnard Castle executions, which might
it gives them, you know, they have the scope to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, they are of the moment. I think we'll call it a halt after this last question, which is from Sam Archibald, who says, as someone who entered the industry after the so-called digital revolution, what advice would Paul have for starting to shift the mindset of clients and peers back to entertaining audiences and resetting our focus for advertising?
Well, the first and obvious one is please read my book. And the second one is read my book again, because actually I have taken 65,000 words to explain exactly why I think this is hugely important, why we have sort of forgotten how to do it, and how actually this is what builds brands. Popular, famous advertising that people engage with and which on the whole they like. You know, that is what builds brands, and there's no reason why we couldn't do it, even though the media landscape has changed, even though it's more difficult, you know, to get mass audiences and get everybody watching the same ad. I accept all that, and it, you know, it makes the world more complicated, and you know, that's advertising agencies' job to sort that one out. But in sorting it out, they mustn't lose track of the perennial truth that, you know, being popular and entertaining and famous is their core job. Whatever media they have to do that, that's what they need to do. So read my book, please.
You heard it, Sam. Thank you, the pair of you. I'm still left wondering whether you could have an ad that is populous and edgy. But I mean, that's for me to.
And edgy.
And edgy.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Can't think of one right now, but I just hate the word edgy because so many ads that have won awards for being edgy are, I think, self-indulgent, miserable tosh. But no, I mean, I suppose Stella Artois campaign started off with those beautiful soft focus South of France films, you know, Jean de Florette, beautiful films, very successful. And as the campaign went on, you can tell the creatives wanted to make it more and more edgy. So, you know, it gets progressively more edgy, and it ends up with like Devil's Island and the Foreign Legion and the guy being sort of locked in the hold so he can drink his Stella Artois in peace. I would like to think that as it got more edgy, it got less effective, but sadly, there's no evidence that that's the case. So perhaps it did still appeal to the sort of, you know, the wife being a Stella Artois drinker in the same way, but you know, so yeah, I just think it's very often edgy is a way of missing the point.
Well, thank you, the pair of you. I enjoyed that. Sam's gone off to finish the book. He's got it. He's got halfway through, so he's going to go to the end. I thought it was a really interesting webinar, so thank you again.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it was really good to sort of have a new angle on this. So thanks, Lucy and Luella.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Luella. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
Couple of bits, which is that AQR's got its AGM coming up on the 30th, so please have a look on the website and register. Webinars are not normally fun, but last year's was absolutely hilarious, and this one promises to top it. We had the Queen and Buckingham Palace last time round, so who knows what's going to happen this time round.
Wow.
We have AQR training models of thinking on the 8th of July. And we have a call for papers for AQR at Aura in August. I think the deadline for submission is the 12th of August. And there are two other webinars coming up featuring the winners of last year's AQR Qualitative Excellence Award, just in time for when we mount a call for papers for this year's. So watch out for the publicity on that one. But anyway, thank you both very much again, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.